Today I'm going to be starting a reading vlog where I see if my reading stats can predict my next 5-star reads. I am a lover of spreadsheets and statistics and pivot tables, and so I wanted to take all of my reading stats from 2024 so far, all of the ways that I categorize books, and see if I could find any common patterns in my 5-star reads of the year. I looked at a lot of different factors, like the average rating of books based on the reason that I read the book, based on the author, because there are some authors I read from multiple times this year, based on the release year of the book, on the way that I read the book, whether it was on audiobook or not, and by the genre that I classified the book as. Using all that information, I looked for the common trends where I most often found 5-star reads this year. And then I took that list of attributes and I looked for books that I had on my TBR or generally on my radar that fit these groupings, hopefully covering as many of them as possible. I ended up selecting 3 books that each fit multiple of these criteria, and I plan on reading all of these books, and theoretically, if my reading stats can give me any direction, I should have a pretty good chance of getting some 5-star reads. I am 17% of the way through 7 days in June, and my first impression of this book is pretty good. I will admit I've had this book on my radar for quite some time. I know this is a very popular book. It was a Reese Witherspoon book club selection a long time ago, and I feel like I've only heard really good things about it, so it has been on my radar, but I thought this was a very sad book, and it does seem like there is going to be some exploration of trauma, and I'm sure there will be sad things that come into this book, but I just expected this to be the type of book where you open page 1 and it just feels really heavy, and the tone is heavy, and it's sad and regretful and just a heavier book to get through. It is not that. It is not. It is written in a very light, contemporary way. There's a lot of funny moments. You're following a woman named Eva who is a single mother to a 12-year-old girl, and her 12-year-old daughter has this little side hustle where she gives people therapy sessions in their apartment. Every character just has this sort of like unique, funny little personality things about them that is just making this really enjoyable to fall into. Eva is an author. She has been writing this erotica series, and it seems like she has been single for a long time, and she's just experiencing the woes of being a single mother in New York. The love interest in this book is a man named Shane, who is also an author, and I haven't gotten to the point where they intersect quite yet in the story, but from reading the synopsis, they're going to bump into each other again, and it turns out that they knew each other a long time ago when they were teenagers. They had like a week together in the summer, 7 days in June, where they built this kind of crazy connection, but then something happened that made them fall apart, and now it is, I guess, a second chance romance as they're running into each other again. Generally, what I think I'm looking for in a romance is something that can be funny and heartwarming, but also I like when it dives into real life emotions, real life human challenges, and has some moments that can be heartbreaking as well. It seems like this is kind of going to be that, so I feel like this was a good selection. I feel like I'm on the right track, and I'm really enjoying it so far. I have been reading A Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez, and I am 2 stories in, which is about the 20% mark. I don't remember exactly how many stories are in this collection. I think maybe 8-ish, but 2 stories in, 20% in seemed like a good place for a first impression. So the first story that I read was called My Sad Dead. This story was about a woman who is living in this bad neighborhood, I believe in Argentina. I think Mariana Enriquez is from Argentina and writes a lot about Argentina in her works. The main character in the story is living in this bad neighborhood, and she is an older woman, somewhere around like 50 to 60 age, and she's staying there because her mother died there and she believes her mother's ghost is still around there. I guess I can't really say too much more about it because it's a really short story and it's just sort of about this woman who sees ghosts in this neighborhood. I gave it a 3-star. It was an interesting story to set the tone of the collection in the beginning. I liked the writing, but not a lot happened, so it was a 3. And then the second story in the collection is the titular story, A Sunny Place for Shady People. And in this story, you're following a woman who's visiting LA. Seems like she used to live in LA. She has some experiences that have happened there, and she's going back because she's writing a story on the Elisa Lam case. Again, can't tell you too much because it's pretty short. Again, didn't feel like I got a lot out of it. I like the writing, I like the concepts, but just as a story, I didn't take anything away from it. So I'm giving that one a 2.5. So my first impression of the collection is not going great. I have read from Mariana Enriquez before. I read Our Share of Night and I did really enjoy that novel. I also previously tried to read her short story collection, The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, and I ended up DNFing that. And with the first impressions of this short story collection, I'm a little worried. I think the writing's good. I think the concepts are interesting, but so far these first two stories, I just didn't feel like there was much of a point to them, and maybe I'm just not seeing it, maybe I'm just not getting it and it's just going over my head, but I'm left feeling a little unsatisfied. I'm 52 pages into the Twyford Code, so I have a good first impression of the book. I went into this one not really knowing what it was about, but Janice Hallett is a trusted author for me at this point because I have had 2 5-star reads from her. So I know I just really like the way that she crafts her mysteries, and I definitely want to complete her full backlist. So I've had the Twyford Code on my shelves, and as I've read the first 50 or so pages, I've gotten a sense of what this story is about. So Janice Hallett tells her stories in mixed media format, which is different things from conventional prose, a conventional narrative. Some of her books are told between emails and texts and interviews and newspaper clippings and article clippings and a whole lot of different types of mixed media. This one seems to be mostly told through voice recordings that are kind of told in a diary entry sort of style from the first person perspective. That is making up the majority of the story so far, but there also are some clips where the main character was interviewing some people, and so you do get a little bit of interview clips as well. And the concept is that there is an investigator who is looking into this missing person case. They came across this iPhone with all these deleted audio recordings, and they used this service to create a transcription of over 200 audio files, and you are reading the audio files that were recorded. They're coming from the perspective of this older man named Smithy, or Stephen, I think? Yeah, Stephen Smith, known as Smithy. And when the audio files begin, he has recently gotten out of prison. He has an adult son that he didn't know about for a long time, who he has a little bit of contact with, and he's the one who actually gave him this phone that he is making these recordings on. And he's telling the story of what happened back when he was around 14 years old. At that time, he was in a remedial English class with a couple other people because he had dyslexia, and he's talking about his teacher that he had at the time, Miss Isles. And he ended up finding this book, and then he brought it to the class, and she was like, oh my gosh, that's a banned book, but I'm gonna read it to all of you. Reads the book to them, gets really obsessed with the book, takes them on this field trip to the town where the author of the book was supposedly from, and then disappears. And so now, all these years later, he's reflecting on that experience. He's trying to get into contact with the other people who were in that class with him and piece together what happened to his teacher and what the significance of the book was. She was clearly taking the book, and she was thinking that there were messages in it. So the Twyford Code, Twyford is the last name of the author who wrote that book, and she was decoding it, thinking that there were some secret messages within it. In the initial framing of the story, the investigator's writing a letter to, I think, a professor and asking them to review these files for help because they have just launched a missing person case. And when they started to investigate the missing person, they found this iPhone with the recordings. So I suppose that old man went missing, or it could be someone else and the phone was just found. I don't really know. I just love Janice Hallett's mysteries, the way she crafts them, how it brings you along in the investigation. It really makes you feel like you're finding something that you shouldn't be looking at and digging into someone's personal effects. And I'm a nosy person, so I love that. This does also seem to be a shorter one that looks kind of tiny, so I feel like it's gonna go by really quickly. I will say I was a little disappointed at first that the mixed media was so simplistic and that most of this is just first person narrative, because that kind of just feels like reading a book. And what I really like about Janice Hallett's books is how much she incorporates mixed media and really like has you piecing all these different aspects of the puzzle box together. It seems like that's not going to be as present in this one, but the mystery has me compelled. So my first impression is pretty good. I'm a little bit beyond the halfway point in 7 Days in June. I found myself 56% of the way through the book, and it is losing me a little bit, and I'm not exactly sure why. I think at this point I was just expecting to feel more, to be more immersed in the story. I say that I found myself at 56% because I can't believe I'm 56% of the way through the book. Like, I feel like more should have happened. I feel like I want to be knowing these characters better, and for some reason I'm just not as immersed in the story. I have gotten to the more hard-hitting parts of the book, and that has to do with things that happened in their past. And their whole history is that they spent 7 days together 20 years ago, and now there's the second chance romance coming in. And I feel like for a while we've been in the past portions, and they were very self-destructive teenagers with a lot of trauma, and I don't know, it's just not like screaming romance to me, I guess. Maybe that's gonna change. Maybe I'll see how they help each other get out of that in some way, but I'm not exactly sure because, you know, they end up separating and spend 20 years not in communication with one another. But it is very romantic that they were writing about each other in their books all of those years. So I don't know. I'm like in the middle right now. I could see myself getting more invested, but for a bit I've been kind of losing investment in the story, so it could go either way depending on how the rest of the story unfolds. I made it midway through A Sunny Place for Shady People last night, and before I work out I wanted to catch you before I get sweaty and tell you what I thought about it, because I do think I might be finishing it tonight. So I read another 3 stories. They were called Face of Disgrace, Julie, and Nightbirds. Face of Disgrace was a story about this woman whose face starts disappearing after the death of her mother. It was a weird one. It had some really good imagery, and it was the fuel for my nightmare that I had last night. I literally had a nightmare then that my face was disappearing, starting with my eyeball, and if you've been following me, you know I hate eyeball things, and it was a horrible nightmare. Originally, I gave that story a 3-star rating, but because of how it has stuck with me, I'm bumping that one up to a 4. The next story was called Julie, and this is told from the perspective of Julie's cousin. Julie has this weird thing where, there's no other way to say it. Ghosts have sex with her and it's consensual. It is a weird story. I didn't rate that one, but it stuck with me. I didn't rate it because it was a little bit dicey, because the story begins with her parents saying that she's schizophrenic, and then it's, you know, because that she's seeing these ghosts, but it's like a fully paranormal story, so then that felt a little bit of a weird thing to involve a mental health condition with all of that. So I don't know, I felt a little bit weird about it, but it was a memorable story nonetheless. And then the third story was called Nightbirds, and I just didn't get that one as much. I also was reading that one when I was getting tired before bed, so maybe my brain just wasn't as engaged with it, but it starts with like this place where the women turn into birds, and then you're following the story of this family and what's going on with them. That one just didn't really do much for me, and so I just didn't really have a rating for it. I have 7 stories left in the collection, and so far it's been kind of a mix of experiences with these stories. Something that I like in a short story collection is when I do feel a sense of cohesion between the stories, which I definitely feel with this. There is such a theme of ghosts and haunting within all of these stories, so they do feel connected, which is nice. I'm not sure which way it's gonna go for me in the remaining 7 stories. I would guess it'll probably also be a mix of some that are hits, some that are not. I would like to get at least 1 5-star story out of this collection, so hopefully that will happen. And maybe now that I'm more into it and I kind of get the themes and what the stories are doing, maybe the second half of the stories will hit better for me. I am now halfway through the Twyford Code, and I have some updated opinions. It is losing me a little bit in the middle. I'm not hating it, but I'm definitely not loving it, and I feel like it's going to be my least favorite Janice Hallett unless something drastically happens in the second half. This is definitely the most simplistic Janice Hallett I've read so far, because it is all just told from these like diary entry voice notes for the most part. There's not a lot of separate pieces that you're bringing together. The mystery is very simple and it's very stretched out, and you're not getting a lot of information. I'm also not getting very invested in this main character. It's this older man who's come out of jail, and I don't know, I'm just not connecting with him. I'm not getting as into the story. I like the initial mystery of the fact that his teacher went missing all these years ago. She was trying to decode this book. Now he's trying to decode this book, understand what happened to his missing teacher. He's getting back together with old classmates, but it's just taking a really long time to develop, and it's just really simple and stretched out. So this middle part has been dragging a little bit. I keep waiting for something to turn or to become more interesting again. I'm hoping things can turn around, but it would have to take a drastic swing to go into loving it territory. Right now it's just okay. I have finished 7 Days in June, and this book actually took me a really long time to read, not because I wasn't enjoying the book, but just because I had some other reading obligations come up, some books I had to complete. I was traveling, a lot just happened over the span of reading this book. I finished several other books and then had to come back to it. So I do think that potentially affected my experience a little bit, because it's not a 5-star. I don't think it would have been a 5-star if I read it all at once, but it did pull me out of the story a little bit, because when I went to go back and into the story. I didn't feel as connected to it. And with a romance, I want to feel really connected to it. And I think that was a little bit my fault. But I did enjoy this one. I do think this was a pretty solid romance. I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's pretty heavy on its themes, or maybe, see, I don't even know because I've been talking about this book for so long. I know when I first started it, I was intimidated because I thought it was going to be a very heavy book, but it was actually more lighthearted. And then it started digging into some of the characters' trauma. And once it got to that part, and really the second half of the book, it started dredging up a lot of really heavy topics. There are discussions of self-harm and addiction, just generally like the experience of growing up in a really difficult situation. So there was a lot of heaviness to that. I am going to be rating this book a 3.5 star. I did like it, and I liked it a little bit more than just like an average 3-star. I think the writing was really good. These characters did feel very real at times. I just wasn't as invested in the love story between these two characters because, I don't know, I don't think I'm a very romantic person, and this whole concept of them having met and spent 7 days together in their past, and then they're kind of writing about each other all these years, and they're coming back together and they get another 7 days to make another chance at love. That sounds romantic, but actually being in the story, and because of their circumstances when they originally met for those 7 days and like all the things they were going through, kind of like seems like they formed a little bit of a trauma bond, a little bit of codependency, and that does get brought up in the story, and I do think it's dealt with in a way that makes sense, and I appreciated the way that the ending worked out. But I just don't know if I was fully believing in the love between these two characters being the grand romance that it was. They did have chemistry, and you know, there's ways that they fit together nicely, but I don't know, I just wasn't like fully immersed in the romance between them. So giving it a 3.5, which is still a good rating. This is my first thing that I've read from this author, and I do have another book from them on my radar, so I do think I'll be reading from them again. I'm here to report that I DNF'd A Sunny Place for Shady People. I was not having a good enough time with the stories in the collection to make me want to keep reading it. I have trouble with short story collections. If I'm not finding a couple that I'm loving, it just doesn't motivate me to keep going because it's not a cohesive narrative, you know? It's like an individual story. You're making a commitment to start a new story every time, and I just was not finding myself feeling super invested in it. I did get over the 50% mark, so I read, you know, over half of it, and then I kept giving a few of the other stories a try, but I would just like find my eyes glazing over them, and I just wasn't really into it. For the most part, if I was going to put an average rating on what I read so far, I'd maybe give it a 2.5 or a 3-ish from what I read so far. I think there were some memorable moments for sure. I think this author and me are just not meant for short stories. I just really like her longer things. You know, Our Share of Night was a really long book, and I did really enjoy that, but now I've DNF'd 2 short story collections from her, so that one just did not work out. I have finished the Twyford Code. This is going to be a tricky one because my opinion of this book did kind of drastically change given the last 40 or so pages of the book, which almost never happens, but the ending of this was so significant in the way that I viewed the story that it did change things for me a bit by that point. Through my experience reading this book, I was not having the best time. The story felt like it was dragging a little bit. I was not as invested in the mystery. I was not as connected to the characters, and I was just hoping for a more dynamic story because of what I've seen Janice Hallett do in the past. So I just wasn't clicking with it, and it was really giving like 2-star energy, and I was bummed about that. But then those last 40 or so pages happened, and it really reframed the story for me. I think this was so clever, and that's what I love about Janice Hallett is right at the ending, I was like, yes, this is a Janice Hallett mystery. Like, it's clever, it's interesting, that's a cool little twist to put on the story. But can that alone save the rest of the story? I don't think it's gonna completely save it. It does kind of make me want to read it again, which I'm not going to do because I know I didn't have the best experience reading it. Like, I was not as entertained as I wanted to be, but it really sets itself up for a reread, and I really like when a book does that and it gives you that feeling at the end where like, oh, I want to go back and like look at everything now, and I don't know, I just think it was really cool. I think she's a very smart writer, and this seems to just be the fluke of her works that I didn't love this one as much, but I've loved everything else that she has done. As for final ratings, I think I'm going to give it a 3 because of the ending. It does boost it up enough to get a good boost. It could be like a 2.5, and maybe it's because I'm just fresh off of the ending and I'm still like, wow, I really like the direction that the story went, that it's kind of boosted up, but it is definitely not my favorite. I really enjoyed The Appeal and The Mysterious Case of the Alberton Angels much more than this one. She has a new book coming out soon. I'm very excited to read that one, The Examiner, and I still also have not read The Christmas Appeal, which I think is a novella kind of spin-off from The Appeal, but I don't regret picking this book. I do think I just kind of had an expectation because I have 2 other 5 stars from this author. I was just going into this one thinking it would just be the same thing, but this one felt quite different just because of the structure of the story. Still glad I read it, but a little upset that I didn't have the best time with it. So that concludes this video and my little experiment to see if my reading stats could help predict my next 5-star read. The answer to that, at least this time, was no. They could not. I did not end up with a 5-star read, which is unfortunate. I ended up with a disappointment, a pretty good book, and something that was just kind of fine, but I wasn't super invested in. I feel like sometimes I find that if I set this expectation for myself that I'm looking for a 5-star, it almost always ends up not resulting in that because I'm like trying too hard to find the 5-star. But nothing even got close to a 5-star, which is a bummer, but that's how it goes. I hope you had fun watching. Let me know down in the comments below if you've read any of these books and what you think about them. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.